to follow along. That's Matthew 5:13 through 20. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? Is it then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men? You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all those who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven.
It's good to be here this morning. Reed has asked if I would speak for him, so you'll have to put up with me for the next few minutes. And I promise I will try to quit pretty close to what is our standard practice here at County Line to stop in time. Of course, Greg, I got it on good account. I could go to midnight, but I promise I won't do that, okay? So it's good to see everybody. It's good to be here. This lesson today is going to have to do with coping with anxiety. And I think we've all experienced some type of anxiety and stress within our lives. You know, how many times have maybe something within our family or maybe some event going on in the world or maybe even a natural disaster has taken place through the course of nature, and sometimes we feel like, well, that's enough. I just can't go on. I'll just quit. I just can't do it. I can't cope with it any longer. Well, you know, that's not an unusual emotion in man. And we're going to look at several characters this morning that had to deal with things. They had to deal with the emotional stresses in life. They had to deal with natural disasters in life. They had to deal with family problems and things of that nature. And yet they were able to overcome it. You know, we're not careful, those things that we just enumerated will cause us to have a broken spirit, won't it? It'll cause our bones to become rottenness. And these are very scriptural topics that we're talking about, because if you turn with me to Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 13, and we'll begin there. Notice what the writer here said. A merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance. By the sorrow of the heart, the spirit is broken. So the writer here recognizes that the spirit of man can be broken. And we find that a merry heart makes a cheerful facial expression. You know, before we make a comment on that, let's turn over to Proverbs chapter 17 and verse 22. A merry heart doeth good like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries to the bones. So the Bible recognizes about a broken spirit. But it also gives us an antidote or some medicine for that, and that is to have a merry heart. The question becomes, how am I going to have a merry heart when all these events are going on? Well, we can't. We find that we have hope. We have expectation in God and in Jesus Christ. And we're going to see how this is going to unfold here in just a minute. You know, we find that the Bible talked about the antidote or medicine for a broken spirit or rottenness to the bones. Well, you know, modern science today only echoes what the Bible has said for many centuries. And I'll just talk very briefly about post-World War II medicine, because we're in a modern world that's only about 75 years old. And of course today man talks about, and they know now, that it's good to go into a hospital or by a sick bed and talk to people and rub their hands and stuff like that. And the scientific explanation for that is it stimulates the enzymes and proteins in the body. Well, the fact is, it does. But what did people do prior to 1945? The world has been around a whole lot longer than post-World War II. What did they do? They trusted in God. They trusted in God. And maybe that's something that we've forgotten with all the modern explanations of things that we need to remember. It's not in the enzymes. It's not in the protein. It's in the Word of God. That is the enzyme. That is the protein by which life is given by God. And so we find that these things are dealt with in the Bible. It's not unusual. You know, Jeremiah had a great task at hand. When God told him, you go speak to these people, oh, by the way, they're not going to listen to you, but you go and look at all the things that Jeremiah underwent in his life, the turmoil and the chaos and all those things that went on. But I wanted you to notice how Jeremiah could withstand and cope with those things. Notice what he says here in Jeremiah chapter 17, beginning at verse 7. Blessed is the man that trusteth in the Lord, and whose hope the Lord is. Blessed is the man that trusts. Now, that's an important word, to trust. You know, that's a word that's used very loosely today. Who can you trust? Who can you have confidence in to lead you in the right direction? Very important word, Brother Brown. Trust. You see the erosion of that word in today's society. When you look at a lot of the events that have gone on in the past 10 years in this country, let's say this, what does it really all evolve around? What does it evolve around? Trust. T-R-U-S-T, trust. Can you trust what you're being told? In the religious world, can you trust what you're being told? So that's an important word. We're coping in anxiety. What do you trust in? Who are you going to trust in? Notice what Jeremiah said. Blessed is a man that trusteth in the Lord. How blessed is that man that trusts in the Lord? Now, Jeremiah did a lot. You know, you're pretty bad when you're in the dungeon of the castle and they let you down into what today would be termed as a cesspool. You know that? They lowered him into the septic tank, Daniel. Okay? That's bad, ain't it? But notice what he's able to write. How was he able to do this? How was he able to cope with those things? Notice what he says here. Whose hope is in the Lord, for he shall be as a tree planted by the waters, and that spreadeth out her roots by the river, and shall not see when the heat cometh. But her leaves shall be green, and shall not be careful in the year of the drought, neither shall cease from yielding her fruit. So what's he telling us here? Well, he's telling us there's going to be problems that come. You know, he talks about the heat. You know, very often we talk about the heat in the kitchen. Well, really, what are we saying with that? We're talking about the anxieties. We're talking about the tribulations, the disturbing distresses that come upon us because of events around about us. That's heat in the kitchen, isn't it? Jeremiah suffered some heat in the kitchen. David suffered some heat in the kitchen. Jesus Christ himself suffered some heat in the kitchen. So these men of the Bible know what they're talking about being anchored in the Lord. It's like that tree by the river whose roots spread out. Where are our roots today? Where are we anchored is the question. Roots anchor a tree, don't they? But those roots, even though they're not seen, bring life to the tree. It reaches out for that nourishment of minerals and water in the ground from the river. That brings up an interesting question to us. Where are our roots today? Where are we embedded? And it's a fact that we're embedded in the world. We've got a problem. Hands down. Because you can be guaranteed if you're embedded in the world's going to give you all the distress and anxiety and tribulation that it can pour on you. And then when it's given all of that, it's going to give you some more. If you let it. It'll break the spirit. Many a person has had a broken spirit. I remember years ago, and you probably heard me tell this, it's probably been 50 years ago or better. Group that I was with used to go over to Bell Street there in Montgomery. There was a rescue mission. And we'd go over there and visit those people there, the homeless people, as they were called, there, those that were down and out. One of the things, though, after you made a few trips, to make a long story short, these people kind of warm up to you. I always found it real interesting who these people were. We have a big misconception sometimes about these people that's out there like that. Now, there are those out there that's out there because they want to be out there because of drugs and alcohol and things of that nature. Don't get me wrong. But I was surprised at how many were ex-doctors, how many were accountants, how many were big businessmen and women, and so on and so forth. What happened? They got down. Something happened, whether it was a cause of their own, by what they had done, or whether it was misfortune placed on them by somebody else. The spirit was broke, wasn't it? And they couldn't get back up. It does happen, doesn't it? Events around will cause your spirit to be broken. So where are you anchored at? Where are you anchored at to get back up? And so we find that even though the drought's going to come, guess what that well-grounded and rooted tree will do in the eyes of anxiety? Still produce. That says a lot, doesn't it? And you know, really, Jeremiah's only echoing what someone else said about 450 to 460 years earlier in Psalm chapter 1. He's only echoing what David had to say. And if you think about a man that has produced trials and tribulations and anxieties and things of that nature, all you got to do is turn to David. He had problems on the outside, externally, with the enemy, didn't he? He had problems internally in his home or with his family, didn't he? And you can write down anything and everything in between all that. Now, some of it David brought on himself, didn't he? And some of it was because of who he was in being king by the enemies, isn't it? So not unlike us today, David had a lot to cope with, didn't he? There's a lot of anxiety and stress in David's life, but notice what the psalmist here said. That's one thing about David. David knew where he was rooted and grounded. Now we're going to see if we have time this morning. David said that he knew where his help came from, the hills of the Lord. Yeah, he had trouble. He had problems. He had anxiety. But where would he turn? Where would he turn? He would turn to the Lord. Notice what he said here. And David wrote this about 460 years earlier than what we read there in Jeremiah. But it's the same take. Kind of what if Jeremiah didn't know about Psalms chapter 1. Blessed is a man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. But he delighteth in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. He shall be like a tree. Now where did we just hear this? From Jeremiah. He shall be like a tree planted by the river of water that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doth shall prosper. Now there's hope and there's confidence, isn't it? What David's really saying here, I know where I'm rooted and grounded. Oh, I'm weak in the flesh. And I do things I regret. But I know where my help comes from. It comes from the Lord. And I need to put those things off. And I need to stay rooted and grounded in the Lord. And I suppose if you look at this, Job's life encompasses what we're talking about here. You know, we can look at Paul's life and Jesus' life. We can look at others in there. We just looked at what Jeremiah had to say and what David had to say. We could go into great detail on that. There are many lessons to be learned from the adversity these people faced and how they were able to deal and cope with it and succeed. You know, Job was a man that was very prosperous. It said that Job, now watch this, was a perfect man in Job chapter 1 and verse 1, one that was upright and feared God, and there were born to him 7 sons and 3 daughters. That's something that the man greatly blessed, said he feared God, was perfect in the very first verse. Did that insulate? Did that isolate? Did that build a hedge? Did that build a wall around Job that the principles of life did not impact him? No. What God gave was the strength to make it through it and to be a better person. We're going to see in the evening. To temper Job. And we talked about that in this morning's Bible class, didn't we? About the things that's going to happen to the children of Israel was done to temper them so they would rely upon God and trust in God and not upon Pharaoh or the world. And so we find, as we look at this, notice what happened here. In verse 14, a messenger came unto Job, the oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them, and the enemy, the Sabeans, fell upon them and took them, and have slain the servant with the edge of the sword. That's Job's livelihood, isn't it? The Sabeans now have come and taken your livelihood. They're destroying it. That is an issue of life sometimes, isn't it? The enemy comes and destroys maybe our livelihood, our way of life. Maybe they destroy our culture. Maybe they destroy the job. You get the picture. And so this is happening to Job. And while he was yet speaking in verse 16, there came another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burnt up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them. Here the fire came from God, from heaven. Doesn't say what this fire was, but you get the picture that God uses the natural events, as we talked about in the Bible class, to carry out his will. You could say this is a natural disaster, if you will. Something of nature that caused this. Now, so far, we've got the stress of your job, your vocation, your work being attacked. Now you've got the stress of natural causes, if you will, being attacked. Now what else have you got? And while he was yet speaking, there came also the Chaldeans, made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and carried them away, and yea, have slain the servant with the sword. So, boy, he's really under attack here, isn't he? The camels. Now, camels were very important, wasn't they? They were used in a lot of trade, wasn't they? That's how you transported your prosperity to the cities, to the caravans, didn't you? And notice what else happened. In verse 18, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking, and their eldest brother, and behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon them, and they're dead. Natural calamity. The winds came. And we've seen the impact of winds, haven't we? Just recently, haven't we? Stress upon life, anxieties. How do you cope with it? And we find in verse 22 a very important statement. And Job didn't. Job never cursed God. But you know what? A lot of times we don't go no further than chapter 1. Job wondered about all this. He sure did. In Job chapter 3, notice what he said. After this, Job opened his mouth, and he cursed the day he was born. He said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and night in which it was said, there's a man-child conceived. Why was I, just let this take me out? Why was I even born if all this is going to happen? But Job wondering in the back of his mind and inside, what in the world is going on? Why is this happening? And notice what he says on over here in verse 24. For the thing which I greatly feared has come upon me, and that which I was afraid of has come unto me. Job said, these calamities have happened to me. These happened to me. But out of all that, Job did not curse God. Now, he wondered about these things. He had some friends come telling him, well, Job, you must have sinned somewhere. And Job said, no. We're going to find in chapter 42, God was not pleased with them friends and their advice. So be careful who you take advice from. Matter of fact, he told Job, if that bunch don't repent in sackcloth and ashes, I'm going to deal with them. But Job was able to maintain his integrity and relationship with God. To give a quick summation, and he prospered more in the latter end than he did in the beginning. Chapter 42. Now, with that being said, could Job had a broken spirit and died without ever finding peace in his tribulation? Yes. Many a person have left this world broken, without hope, without expectation. So it does happen, doesn't it? It does happen. But you know, it doesn't have to be that way to cope with these things. You know, and when we're talking about coping with something, it's our how we react to solving our own efforts to solve the problem. You know, how confident are we to be able to minimize or tolerate the stress and conflict? How are we able to cope with it? And what about this word? The word actually means to choke out or to strangle. And that's what it does. Worry chokes out the goodness, doesn't it? The happiness, the peace, the joy that we have. What does worry do? It gets around the neck, it'll just strangle the life out of you, won't it? It'll cause you to be rottenness to the bones, won't it? Sure will. Now what about anxiety? Being anxious about things. The Bible talks about that. That's having a disquieted spirit, being disturbed by things. Your soul, your mind is uneasy, you're nervous. Well, there's three things that have an impact upon what causes that, so we're told. One is insecurity. Insecurity. We know something bad's going to happen and nobody can do anything about it and I have nobody to turn to for help. That's insecurity, isn't it? What about helplessness? Oh, there's nothing I can do. Woe is me, it's all on me. What about feeling isolated? There's no one there. No one to help me. Just those three statements right there and those three, I guess, attributes of coping and anxiety and stress, there's enough right there to give you stress and anxiety, isn't it? But you know, it doesn't have to be that way. Peter said in 1 Peter chapter 5, in verses 6 through 9, to resist who? The devil, and he'll flee. So what do we have to do? We have to resist those things. We have to resist those temptations that's planted with us. And they are from the devil. That's another lesson. You know, why do natural things happen? Well, that's a lesson in itself. It's real interesting, but I don't have time to even remotely start into that. Quick summation is we're dealing with fallen man and we're dealing with a broken world. How does that happen? Did God do that? Or was it because of man's rebellion against God that brought these things on? Now, in summation, what brought the flood on? What brought about those cataclysmic events that changed the shape of the world, that changed the course of the world, that changed the natural elements of the world that was set in order? What brought that on? Man's mind was on evil continually. Man, in his rebellion and his stubborn state. Then what did man do? Well, he went out and built a Tower of Babel so he could go up and advise God and tell him how to run things. And so on and so forth during the course of human history. And yet we find just because these things are do not mean that we can't exist and live and be at peace with them in our lives. All we can do is what is Christ. Yeah, the choice is ours. The choice is ours in these things. You know, we can have security. Hebrews chapter 4. Let's see what Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 16 has to say. That's what he says here. Beginning verse 15. For we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. Did Jesus face some of the things of life that we faced? Yeah. Did he face temptation? Yeah, look at Matthew chapter 4. Did he face the stress of having to go to the cross when his sweat became drops of blood? Did he ask God to let this cup pass from him? That's our high priest to do. He knows about those things. He knows about the stress of life. He knows about the anxieties that we have being human. But notice what else the writer here says. Let us therefore come boldly. How do he say come? Boldly. Unto the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in the time of need. Where can we go? We can go to our high priest, who is there to help us. See, that's hope. We don't have to be insulated. We don't have to feel like we're isolated. We don't have to feel helpless, and we don't have to feel insecure. We have a high priest that's gone before us. And we can have this grace and mercy that he gives. And this help that he can give. You know, we find that, when Jesus said this, the disciples, they were left wondering about, what's he talking about? All this tribulation and stuff, and being of good cheer and things like that. And yet we find that's what Jesus told them, didn't he? He said that in this world, you're going to have tribulation. You're going to have tribulation. That's intense anxiety. You think the kitchen's hot at 350 degrees? What if the heat gets up to 500 degrees? And that's what was going to happen to those disciples he was talking to. They were going to face some intense anxieties, wasn't they? I mean, when you running for your life and being stoned at and cast out, and later on in your later years, you didn't live to die natural cause except John. You're crucified upside down, your head cut off, you boiled in oil. Pretty good reason to be anxious, isn't it? Jesus was telling them in this life you're going to have tribulation. But notice what he tells them here. But be of good cheer. What? Be of good cheer. Don't be anxious. Don't be burdened down. Be calm. Be relaxed. Why could he say that? That in itself is startling. And these disciples, no doubt, they were left going, do what? Well, that really goes against the course of nature, that doesn't it? And the reason he could say this to them and give them hope and comfort is because he says, I have overcome these things. I have overcome the world. What he's telling them, you're going to suffer these trials and tribulations. I suffer these trials and tribulations. But I'm here to help you to overcome them. And you can. Almost echoes what we just read Hebrews chapter 4, right? We have a high priest that knows about our sufferings, and he's there to help us in time of need. Yeah. And I'm about out of time, but I ain't got started yet. And so we find that these things are there. Jesus, we just talked about how to cope with temptation. I'll just do a quick overview and we may come back to this later. In death. We talked about Matthew 4, the devil taking it up to the temple. And we talked about him wanting that cup to pass from him. And all those things that went on in his life. What about the Apostle Paul? The things that he had to cope with, and we talked about this, and I'm in agreement with Reed on it. There's some things there that we don't ever think about in the life. The Apostle Paul, as he's writing those epistles to the different congregations, you see kind of an overview in his writings of something that's bothering Paul. His prior life. What had he been guilty of? Well, he had been guilty of persecuting the church and hailing men and women into prison. Well, if you were hailed into prison back then, we all know about the Roman sporting events and all those things that went on. That made Paul an accessory. Notice what he says here in 1 Timothy chapter 1, beginning in verse 13. Who before was a blasphemer, a persecutor, and an injurious person. But you know what Paul recognized? He said, out of all that I obtained mercy. I obtained mercy. Because when I learned that I was doing it in an unlearned and unskillful manner or ignorant manner, that I was doing it in the wrong way, I changed. Thereby Paul had God's help, didn't he? How was he able to withstand what he told the church at Corinth, being shipwrecked, being stoned, being beaten with rods, being hungry, being naked, in perils of the deep, in perils of the brethren, in perils of my countrymen? You got to ask yourself a question when you get to that verse. Paul, when wasn't you in perils, okay? And notice what he says on top of that. With all these things that's going on in my life, the care of the church is daily. Would it be fair to say Paul had a plate full? Plus? Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that Paul had a plate full. But notice what he was able to say in his writings here as we close this out and wind this down, and we'll have to come back to it later. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, notice what he says here. He says, no, verse 16, for this cause we faint not, but though our outward man perish, yet the inward man is renewed day by day. You got these events going on with the outward man, and it's destructive to the outward man, but the inward man is renewed day by day. Now, how can that be? Because of who he trusted him and what he hoped for. You know, when you go there and you look at the life of the Apostle Paul, there's a lot of stress and anxiety and tribulation in that life, isn't it? But notice what he wrote here in the next verse. For our light afflictions. The what, Paul? It don't sound right to me. In the grand scheme of things, they were light afflictions, weren't they? Paul saw it that in these afflictions, he got to suffer a little bit like Christ did. And so that gave him hope. And these light afflictions, and notice he said about these things. What did he say? How long are they going to last? They're going to last forever. Nope. It's going to be brief. It's going to be brief. He said, for a moment. These afflictions that we suffer in life are but for a moment. Then it's going to be gone. Why? Because we'll be gone. It's only for a moment. And so we find that we look at things, where we look not at things that are seen, but at things which are unseen. So Paul was looking at those unseen things, which he says are eternal. That's what he was looking for. Those things are eternal. Those things that are eternal is what he was looking for. That's why he could write such passages of Scripture that we find in Philippians chapter 4. Notice what he says here. Be careful for nothing. Don't be anxious. That's what that says. I think some translations may use the term anxious there in place of not being careful. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. What was Paul looking? Paul was looking to the author and finisher of his faith. Philippians chapter 3, verse 14, I press toward the mark. I press. You know, when something is in a press, it's being pushed against it. The picture I get here is the Apostle Paul. If he was a mule hooked to a loaded wagon, and you got the collar and the reins and the chest strap pushing against him, and he's pulling the load, he's pressing on. How can he do that? How can you press on with that load, with that fear that you have? He said, I press on to the mark of the prize of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. What was his focal point? Paul knew that no matter what this life laid on him. As long as he focused on the cross and pressed on, it wasn't but a light affliction and short-lived. So what did God want the Apostle Paul to do? Did he want the Apostle Paul to be broken and burdened down with all the affairs and cares and things of this life? Or did he want the Apostle Paul to put those things aside, trust in God, and preach the Word? See, if we burden down with all the cares and things of that nature of life, guess what we are not able to do? To preach the Word. So you leave all these other things with God in summation. You know, the psalmist said this in Psalms chapter 37. And we kind of touched on it a little bit about commitment, but I want you to notice something here. There's 4 things that we need to be able to overcome those things. And to put them in proper perspective. And to deal with it, and the psalmist David gives us all 4 things that we need. Notice what he says here, beginning in verse 3. Trust in the Lord. God knows we need somebody to trust in, doesn't he? Who did David say trust in? Trust in the Lord, but there's a little other word that it connects the next thought. It's called and. Do good. Okay? Paul in Philippians chapter 4, if you go on down about being anxious, he talked about things that you are to do to know that the God of peace is with you. To trust. Notice another one that we need. We as human beings need something to delight in, don't we? It's a part of life, isn't it? Well, God recognizes that too. David recognized that we need to have delight. But notice what he says here. Delight thyself also in the Lord. Trust where? In the Lord. Delight where? In the Lord. Notice another one he says here. Boy, this is a big one right here. But number 5, verse 5, all of them big. How many people you know committed? Commitment in our society ends with a $sign starts. You just write it down. But notice what the psalmist David said. Commit thy ways unto the Lord. So now we have trust, we have delightment, we have commitment, and guess what else we look for in life? Rest. Rest. Sometimes, you know, that word there, that word and the actions that go with it elude us, doesn't it? The rest. The Bible tells us to rest. And David recognized that his rest was where? Rest in the Lord. Now there's a 3-letter word there again, and. Be at peace in the Lord. Rest in the Lord. Be calm in the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Those 4 things right there David said that we need. And that's how we combat these things, these feelings of anxieties and these fears and these phobias. What do we trust in? What do we delight in? What do we commit in? And what do we rest in? You know, if we're not rested in that, then we probably going to have a lot more unrest in our lives before we get rest. But these people were able to withstand this because they did just what the psalmist David. They trusted, they were committed, they delighted, and they rested strictly in the Lord. And you know, in order to have those things today, there's something that must be done. It's not something that God looks down and takes a stick and hits us over the head and says, you're going to do this or you're going to do that with 3 ball agents. I suppose it don't get any worse than crucifying the Son of God when it comes to crimes. You can enumerate them all you want, but that's got to top the list. That a man would kill that which created him. Now, what about everything else? It's bad, Brother Browning, don't get me wrong. And that's what they had done there in Acts 2. Peter pointed the fingers at them and said, by wicked hands you have done this. If they didn't have a lot of strength stress and anxiety before it. They got it now, haven't they? You have killed your Creator. You killed the very one you created in the image of. You've done this. And they realized they needed to do something. But you know what? Peter didn't tell them that you need to go to Caesar, or you need to go to Pilate, and you need to beg forgiveness of Pilate. So that's what the children of Israel done when we studied in our Bible class this morning. They went to Pharaoh looking for relief, didn't they? What did Peter tell them? You want to get these problems out of your life, and you want to get things at peace, and you want to begin a trustworthy relationship with God and commit to God, delight in God. This is what you got to do. Notice what he told them here. He told them, Peter said unto them, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sin. That's where you start, right there. You put off those former things that were of the world, and you begin to put on the new things of God. It's called the new creature, isn't it? Colossians chapter 3. And you embark on that road. Is that going to make it any less anxious or stressful? It may just begin some stress. But as you grow and you develop and God tempers you, you learn how to deal with it and you move on. Because where's your focus now? Is it on man or is it on the cross of Christ? What's on the cross of Christ? Thereby, the afflictions become what Paul said, light. And only for a moment. Because now you got hope. You got a place that will be rest in heaven one day. All these former things will be done away with. The heavens and earth are going to melt away with the fervent heat and the works thereof. Gone. Do we want to be gone with them? Or do we want to be with God? The lesson is yours. We stand and sing the song of invitation. Let's be sharp for us.